Hi, this is Kelly from paperbeadrollers.com, and today I'm going to show you some techniques you can use with paper bead stencils. Let's get started. If cutting paper strips isn't your most favorite thing about making paper beads, you may want to try using a stencil to make it a little easier. At paperbeadrollers.com, I have several stencils available right now and more in development. Today I'll show you some decorating techniques you can use with all of these stencils. A stencil is a piece of mylar with shapes cut into it. It's flexible and you can use either side of the stencil. It doesn't matter which side faces up. This is the standard triangle stencil. It has 3 different sizes of triangle, but you can also use the breaks in the triangles to make the more common, shorter size of strips. The most straightforward way of using this stencil is to simply take a pen or a pencil and run it down through each of the grooves to create your cutting lines. The reason I've chosen to have grooves along the edges rather than just having a big open strip shape is for stability. When I tested these stencils as large open shapes, the sides gave way as I was drawing, which is not just frustrating, but can create lines that aren't straight. And that is a key thing with paper beads. If your strip isn't straight, your bead is not going to look right. So having these grooves keeps your pen in place and it helps you create a much straighter line. Once your lines are drawn, you can cut your strip with a cutting board or with scissors. Go slow and make sure you're cutting exactly on the line so that your final bead will be even and smooth. Now, let's have some fun. I'm going to trace my cut strip first using a pen or marker because I want some dark cut lines. Then I'm going to get out my Tombow markers and I'm just going to run them along those cut lines. Now notice that I'm using a light blue paper instead of white. That's so the cut edges of my paper aren't so bright white. It will blend in better on the finished bead. Now you don't have to spend time coloring in the center of the strip because that part isn't even going to show. You just need to use the edge of the marker tip to color along the edges of the strip. Now I'm going to cut it out with scissors and we'll see what we get. I'll just roll this with my paper bead roller from paperbeadrollers.com. We'll tack down the end with some glue. And here is the finished bead with the color exactly where I wanted it. Now these Tombow markers also do really well with glaze. Here's the same kind of bead glazed with Deco Art's triple thick glaze. Now you can see these colors are popping and there was really no bleeding of the color when the glaze was wet. Now for our next technique, we're going to do an ombre effect using a direct to paper ink pad technique. Now I'm going to warn you, it's a little bit messy. These are stamping ink pads. Foam pads work best for this technique. These particular ones are Catherine Pooler brand, but if you want something that you can get at your big box store, you can look at Colorbox. They have some great foam pads as well. I've chosen 3 different ink pads, a dark color, a medium, and a light. Now these inks are water-based inks, not dye-based inks. Now I want my color to go from light at the outside edges of the bead to dark in the middle of the bead. So I'm going to start with my darkest color at the tip of the strip. Hold the stencil securely. Now you can even use some washi tape to tape it in place if you want. Just pick up your ink pad and wipe it across the stencil. Push down a little bit, but not too hard. I'll cover each section of stencil with my 3 colors. Medium, and now the light. Now for the gaps where the stencil came across, just dab the ink pad on it a bit. It looks messy now, but once you cut the strip, you won't even be able to tell. Now I'll cut out my strips. Now you need to be sure that you cut just slightly to the inside of the ink line so that you don't end up with any light strips at the edges of your beads. Now I'll roll the bead and secure the end with glue. And there is an ombre bead. Now the only hitch to this is that the ink does bleed when you go to glaze it. So brush your glaze on from the light to the darker areas. I'm not entirely sure how well these will do with the dipping method, but it's definitely worth a try because these colors, they just pop when they're glazed. Now I'll use the slim Euro bead stencil to do another ombre technique. This time we're going to use the baby wipe technique. Now both the slim and the wide version of the Euro bead use 3 strips each, so this works just the same on both. We're going to use a baby wipe to smear the ink into the stencil, and we're going to ombre it from light pink to dark pink. Now notice again that I'm using pink paper, not white. This is so my raw edges that don't get colored with the ink will blend in better with my bead. Fold the baby wipe over a few times and wrap it around your finger. Always start with the lightest color first. Press the baby wipe into the ink pad to pick up a good amount of ink. Now the ink will be darkest where we begin, and it will get lighter as we run towards the edge of the strip and the ink rubs off. So make sure that you start in the middle of the second Euro bead strip. I'm just going to press and wipe and making sure I get good coverage as I go. You'll see that as I continue, the ink is getting lighter, which is what we want for this ombre effect. You can also control the darkness or lightness of your ink a little bit with pressure. The harder you press, the more ink is going to transfer to the paper. The lighter you lift up, the less ink is going to transfer. Okay, now that we're done spreading the lighter ink, I'm going to dip my baby wipe into the darker ink. This time we're going to start at the end of the third strip, not in the middle. The darkest ink should be here at the end of the strip. So now I'm going to wipe along, and the ink is getting lighter as I go until you see I get to this middle where my lighter inks begin. Now I'm not stopping right here at the ink line. I'm going to run this darker color just a little bit up into the lighter color just so it blends really nice. And there we go. And like we did before, I can just take my baby wipe and dab a little bit into the gaps, and you won't even be able to tell that they're there when your bead is done. Now I'm going to cut these strips, and I'm being careful to cut right inside this ink line because I don't want to end up with any gaps in my color along the edges here. If I cut too far out, you'll see the paper with no ink on it. And it's time to roll. All right, and you can see that right here there is a little bit of a line where I didn't cut it quite inside the ink line. Now I can use my baby wipe to try and hide that a little bit, but I'll have to be careful not to ruin the ombre effect of the bead by putting ink where it doesn't belong. This is why it's so important for you to cut right inside the ink line and not outside. Now I'm going to glaze this bead using the DecoArt's Triple Thick Glaze. Wow, this really pops when you get the glaze on it. Now, as I said before, when you use an ink technique like this, it does bleed into the glaze, so you'll have to be careful not to mess up the look of your bead. And there you are. 3 ink and stencil techniques you can use to make beautiful paper beads. Please hit like and subscribe to the channel so you can get more paper beading tutorials and share these with your paper bead loving friends. Happy rolling!